Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome to this quiet, flickering corner of time. Whether you're curled beneath the safety of blankets or chasing stillness after a long day, know that you're not alone tonight. Before we journey back through the frozen winds of medieval winters, let us pause, not to judge the past, but to feel it. What was it like to hunger when the fields lay dead, to tremble beside a dying fire, to pray not for riches, but for a crust of bread? This is not a tale of kings and conquests. It is a whisper from the hearthstones of the forgotten, from cradles that froze over and spoons that scraped the bottom of empty pots. This is a story of ordinary people who survived extraordinary cold. So close your eyes if you wish. The snow is falling, the fire is fading, and the wind remembers everything. In the medieval world, winter wasn't just a season. It was a sentence. Long before calendars gave it a start or end date, people felt its arrival in their bones, in the aching knees of an old woman stirring ashes before dawn, in the silence of the chicken coop. No eggs today. In the brittle sound of bark snapping in half when no dry firewood remained. A boy in a village near Essex once scratched into the wooden wall of a cottage. December, when hunger walks on two legs. The cold didn't just seep through cracks in the walls. It entered through your fingernails, your breath, your dreams. And it didn't leave. Not until it had taken something, a lamb, a child, a mother. Hope, perhaps, was the first to go. If there was a villain in this story, it was the sky itself. The medieval climate was colder than today, and between the 14th and 19th centuries, Europe endured what we now call the Little Ice Age. It wasn't a single storm, but a steady, gnawing frost that sank its teeth into generation after generation. In the winter of 1709, known as the Great Frost, the River Thames froze solid. Entire harvests failed. Wine barrels cracked open from the cold. Birds froze mid-flight and fell from the sky like feathery stones. But the poor, they did not fall. They simply lay down, quietly, and waited. For most medieval peasants, the hearth was the center of life and death. Imagine a hut barely tall enough to stand in. Smoke hangs in the air like a ghost that never leaves. There is no chimney, only a hole in the roof. Children huddle close to the embers, not to feel warm, but less dead. Fuel is whatever you can find. Dried animal dung, moss, rotting thatch, splinters of a broken cartwheel. And when there's nothing left to burn, they burn time. They wait, they endure. Let us talk of food, or more truthfully, its absence. A meal might be a thin broth made from boiled onions and bitter herbs. Sometimes bark was scraped from trees and ground into flour. Bread, if it could be found, was hard as stone and dark as sorrow. And yet they ate, not with pleasure, but with the discipline of survival. Each mouthful not nourishment, but resistance. Women stitched layers of linen around their babies, knowing full well it wouldn't stop the chill, but believing somehow that love itself had a temperature. Old men whispered prayers not in Latin, but in breath. And every night, across villages and valleys, someone told a story, not to entertain, but to remind, we are still here. So tonight, as you lie in warmth, with a roof overhead and food in your belly, remember those who didn't have such luxuries, not because they were lazy, not because they were foolish, but because they were born in a world that took more than it gave, and still they gave to each other, to us. They built the world we now sleep safely in, and tomorrow, if you return, We'll speak of hunger that howled like wolves and kings who froze like beggars. But for now, close your eyes. The wind outside still whispers their names. Some say the worst part of medieval hunger was not the emptiness of the stomach, but the silence that came with it. Because hunger in those days wasn't noisy. It didn't scream. It crouched in corners. It sat beside beds. And it watched you undo your belt one more notch, then one more. It crept into marriages like a shadow, turning affection into tension, turning men into ghosts who walked out at dawn and didn't return, not out of cruelty, but because they couldn't stand to see the ribs of their children protruding like the bones of a shipwreck. And sometimes they didn't come back. Shame was another meal to swallow, served cold every morning. There are stories passed down, not in scrolls or libraries, but in the memory of places, of men who abandoned their farms in winter, not to flee, but to die, where their children wouldn't find them. One such man was called Edric, from a northern village long since swallowed by the moor. The tale says he kissed his wife's forehead, left his boots by the door, and walked barefoot into the snow. They found him when the thaw came, kneeling beneath a tree, his hands cupped as if holding something, though they were empty. And yet, even in this bleakness, the human soul refused to go quietly. During some of the harshest winters, communities turned to shared granaries, small stone buildings where surplus grain, if it existed, was kept under the care of a trusted elder. Sometimes that elder was a woman, a widow often, too old to bear children, but still carrying wisdom like fire beneath ash. She would measure grain by handfuls, not by weight. She would know who had mouths to feed and who had only memories. And always, she gave a little more than she should, because that's what kept people alive, not just the food, but the mercy. In some towns, there were rituals, not religious in the formal sense, but sacred nonetheless. One such ritual in a mountain village in what is now Austria involved the baking of ghost loaves during the coldest week of the year. Families would shape bread not in round or oval forms, but in the vague outlines of hands, some large, some childlike. They would leave these on stone windowsills at night, not for the hungry, but for the dead. The belief was simple. If you feed those who passed, they will keep watch over those who remain. And somehow it helped. Whether by faith or imagination, the act of giving made the cold seem less cruel. It reminded people they were not forgotten, even if they had nothing left to give but remembrance. Children especially bore the weight of winter not in silence, but in questions. Why don't we eat today, Mama? Why is the fire so small? Why did God make snow if it hurts our feet? And to these there were no easy answers, only lullabies, only stories. A father might speak of spring as if it were a kingdom he once visited. He would describe green shoots rising from the earth, berries like drops of ruby on the vine, the hum of bees so thick it drowned out sorrow. And the children would listen, eyes wide, mouths dry, hearts full. Hope, in winter, was often made of fiction, but it worked, because fiction is simply truth that hasn't happened yet. And somewhere in the dark, a mother might add a splash of water to the pot and say, "The stew needs to stretch a bit longer tonight. The saints are hungry too." The saints, yes, even they were hungry. In medieval villages, statues of saints in chapels would sometimes be dressed in shawls or small cloaks woven by hand, not as decoration, but as offering, as conversation. Please, Saint Bridget, bring warmth to my baby's bed. Please, Saint Cuthbert, spare the last of our sheep. In one recorded case, villagers in Flanders took down the statue of St. Lawrence and placed him inside a barn so that he too could suffer with them. It wasn't blasphemy. It was honesty. Why should saints float above suffering when even the holy bread had become scarce? Faith in those winters was not about grandeur. It was not Latin or incense or bells. It was found in cracked hands clasped over cold soup, in a whisper sent into the snow, in a loaf of bread left at a stranger's doorstep before dawn. They did not need miracles. They needed to survive the night, and many did not. Records are vague. The deaths weren't always counted, but the memory of them lives in the stories, in the songs that end too soon, in the names carved into stone with knives. And yet, the wheel turned, the frost retreated, grass returned, spring came not with trumpets but with small mercies, a flower growing from dung, a goat given milk, a child who finally laughed again, and in that moment, when food returned, it was not just a necessity. It was joy. It was reunion. It was forgiveness. Some kissed the first loaf of the season before eating it. Others broke it and shared it with the dead, leaving crumbs on graves just in case. Because the line between life and death was thin and made of bread. But food was not always about chewing. Sometimes it was about pretending. There were families who stirred pots with nothing inside, just water and stones, so the children would fall asleep to the smell of something that wasn't there. In some villages, people made dream stews, an empty cauldron placed on the fire, into which each person would name the ingredient they wished they had. A girl might whisper, "Onions." A boy, "A fish from the river." The mother might say nothing, just close her eyes and imagine the stew her own mother once made with rosemary and fat and laughter. They would all sit around that pot, and when the heat had gone out, they would say grace. It sounds foolish now, but in the deep of winter, imagination was the only spice left, and children fed on stories as much as soup. There was the tale of Dame Haviland, a widow who lived alone atop a hill with nothing but a spindle and a hearth. Every winter she would spin yarn from frozen moonlight and barter it for turnips and beans. The villagers said her stew could bring back the dead. They came from miles around, not just for the food, but to sit in her hut and feel warm from the inside out. Of course, no such woman existed, but it didn't matter. To believe in her was to believe that somewhere, somehow, a woman could hold back the cold with only her courage. And women did just that, over and over. In most peasant households, it was the woman who fed others first and last, and sometimes not at all. There is a small chapel in Bohemia, its records barely surviving. In the margins, a monk scrawled, "The mother eats second, or not at all. When famine comes, she vanishes like bread in broth." Women's hunger was often invisible because it was quiet and chosen. A girl of 13, newly married, might find herself in a stranger's home, feeding his aging father, his cousins, his livestock, and when the bread ran short, she would tear her half in two and call it enough. There were few words for this, no poems, no songs, just the look in her eyes, that brittle, glowing silence that says, "I won't let them starve, even if I do." And somehow those women endured. They created ways of stretching food, soaking stale loaves in warm milk, boiling herbs into broths so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl. They found nourishment in wild sorrel, in dried nettles, in mushrooms that only the old crones dared to touch because they knew which ones wouldn't kill you. Knowledge was as valuable as wheat, passed down from mother to daughter or from widow to orphan, in hushed tones beside fires that barely crackled. And if you listen closely, you can still hear those lessons whispered in the wind. In many places, especially in colder regions, there was one meal reserved only for the poorest. Bones boiled twice. First, to make broth. Second, to make hope. These bones were often shared between families. One would boil them the first day, then pass them to the next house over. By the third or fourth pot, the bones gave no flavor, but they still made something warm, and warm was enough. Because warmth in that world wasn't just a sensation, it was survival. It was kindness. That is why, in certain French villages, the hearth was considered sacred. When a fire was first lit in a new home, neighbors would bring embers from their own, not matches, not flint, but embers carried in clay bowls under wool. To share fire was to say, "I see you. I want you to live." Not everyone had fire. Not everyone had bowls. But even then, someone always shared. Even when the church failed, even when the king taxed the last crumb, people, common, weather-worn people, found ways to love each other through famine. And sometimes, just sometimes, even those in power noticed. One such story survives in the records of an abbey near York, where a young abbot broke with tradition and ordered the monastery's stores open to the villagers during a winter of particular cruelty. The monks protested. The lord of the land threatened excommunication, but the abbot insisted. He said, "If Christ fed the multitudes with fish and bread, surely we can feed a village with butter and grain." And so they did. And that winter, the bells of the abbey rang not for Mass, but for mealtime. The villagers called it the Year of the Kind Bells. They never forgot the sound. You see, food in the Middle Ages was more than sustenance. It was language. It said what couldn't be spoken. I forgive you. I see you. You belong. So when it was missing, so were the words, and silence became the meal. But not all hunger was physical. In the shadows of stone cathedrals and candlelit chapels, another kind of famine festered, a famine of justice, a famine of meaning. For those born into toil and mud, there were no sermons in their language, no Latin to wrap around the ache in their stomachs, only bells tolling from far above as if heaven had walls. To many peasants, God was not father nor friend. He was a lord like any other, unreachable, unspeaking, his back turned toward the suffering of his lowest tenants. And yet they still prayed. Why? Because prayer, like hunger, was a rhythm. It kept time when the sun disappeared for weeks. It filled silence when the wind howled too long. It gave shape to fear. A mother might kneel beside a cradle made of bundled straw and murmur, "Sweet Virgin, if you must take him, do it gently." She wasn't bargaining. She wasn't pleading. She was bracing. Because death in winter was not a question, only a schedule. Still, they marked the saints' days not with feasts, those were rare, but with candles made of tallow so thin they flickered out before the psalm was done. They hung sprigs of evergreen over thresholds, not for beauty, but to trick the darkness into thinking life still lingered inside. Faith in that era was not clean. It was ragged, soot-stained, trembling. It lived in roadside shrines barely bigger than a loaf, in scraps of scripture worn smooth by fingertips. There were pilgrimages made barefoot across frozen ground, not for healing, but for permission to keep going. And sometimes people turned to saints who never existed. Local legends, herb women canonized by rumor, children martyred by myth. There's a record in a Bavarian ledger of a boy named Elias, a mute child who, they claimed, never once cried from hunger. When the famine hit, people whispered that placing a crust of bread beneath his name at night would guarantee a dream of fullness. It didn't matter whether it was true. What mattered was the act, because in winter, hope was the only meal without a ration. Meanwhile, in manors perched atop the hills, the lords dined in guarded halls. Roasted pheasant, sugared dates from the south, wines that steamed in goblets of pewter, their hearths were wide enough to walk into, their dogs were fed better than most men. But even there, winter crept in, not through the stones, but through the mind. Paranoia bloomed like frost on the psyche. What if the peasants rose? What if the grain stores were burned? What if the holy relics no longer worked? So they built walls higher. They taxed deeper. They silenced song, yet they could not silence the earth. The winters grew longer. From roughly 1300 onward, Europe entered what scholars now call the Little Ice Age, a time when harvests failed for reasons no one understood, when summers were brief and sour, when rains fell like punishment, and no amount of prayer, nor coin, nor noble blood could stop it. In 1315 it began. The Great Famine. Rain drowned the fields, seed rotted, livestock perished in muck, and this time even the rich tasted fear, because gold cannot be boiled into porridge, and velvet offers no warmth to a starving child. In monastery records there are abrupt gaps, entire years where no baptisms were recorded, no weddings blessed, no burials sung, because people died where they fell, unseen, unmourned. Cities fared worse. The hungry fled the countryside, thinking the towns had bread. But the towns had nothing, only gates and guards paid to keep the dying out. Some were caught stealing, others begged for moldy flour or gnawed bones, and when hunger pressed hard enough, some turned on each other. Cannibalism, a word we flinch from, but which still lingers in the margins of manuscripts, scrawled in trembling ink, as if the scribe didn't want to write it but couldn't lie. A chronicler in Bruges wrote, "A mother was seen carrying a child with no breath. When asked what she carried, she said, 'A blessing I must bury,' but they saw her teeth stained red." Even these accounts, though rare, are a kind of mercy, because they remind us that people saw, people recorded, people did not forget. And yet, this darkness was not total. In the same cities where bread was guarded with blades, there were also kitchens opened by monks, nuns who boiled root vegetables for hours so they'd soften for toothless mouths. There were pot-bellied priests who gave away their cheese, women who snuck onions into beggars' sleeves. In Norwich, an anonymous woman is remembered not by name, but by her deed. She sold her dowry ring to buy flour for her neighbors. They say the ring turned to salt in the baker's hands, but that didn't matter. The loaves still rose, because the greatest miracles were never flashy. They were quiet, they were human, and somehow they were enough. By 1322, the rains relented, the sun returned, fields dried, but not everyone came back. Villages stood half empty, farms overgrown, tools rusted where they'd last been laid down. The survivors emerged pale, smaller, older than their years. Children who'd forgotten how to laugh, mothers who no longer sang, and yet they planted again. They dared to eat without weeping. They dared to believe that hunger might not return. They rebuilt ovens, mended grain sacks, sharpened scythe, and in the silence between sowing and harvest, they told stories of the famine, of the dead, of the woman who sold her ring, of the abbot who opened the stores, of the boy who never cried, and the telling itself became nourishment, because to speak of pain is to name it, and to name it is to survive it. So when we ask, why was food so terrible in the Middle Ages? Perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Food was what it had to be. It was bark. It was boiled moss. It was charity. It was ash. But it was never only what sat on a plate. It was what passed between hands, what bound a village, what made mercy more than myth. And perhaps that was enough. But the earth had not finished breaking them. Just as the fields began to turn green again, just as the children began to hum again, a wind came from the east. It didn't howl. It whispered through ports, across merchant ships, carried not by invaders but by trade. First it was a cough, then a swelling under the arm, then silence. By 1347, the Black Death arrived, and with it the meaning of hunger changed. People no longer begged for food. They begged for time, for mercy, for breath. There are no proper records. The quills broke too fast. The parchment filled too soon. But in some places there are notations, single sentences in the margins of church books. All gone. No mass today. Buried them in one pit. In Avignon, the gravediggers collapsed beside their work. In London, they built plague trenches, long, deep cuts in the earth where bodies were layered like firewood. And what of food? Food piled up in market stalls, untouched because the sellers had died. Bread grew moldy on church steps. Apples rolled down empty streets. What good is wheat when the baker is gone? What use is meat when no one can bury the butcher? This famine was not of grain, but of hands. And then it passed. As cruelly and mysteriously as it had come, the plague slowed. By 1352, the bells tolled less frequently. The earth grew quiet again, but not in peace. The survivors wandered a changed world. Imagine a village of 60 souls. Now imagine 15. The blacksmith gone. The midwife gone. The boy who once climbed trees, his name spoken like a ghost story. What does a child eat when no one remembers how to grow? What does a woman become when there are no other women? For a time, Europe was a continent of ghosts. Wheat grew wild in fields no one owned. Goats bleated at empty doors. And in that silence, something new crept in. Joys. With labor scarce, peasants began to demand pay. Some left their lords entirely, seeking better masters or no masters at all. This frightened the powerful, not just because of the loss of hands, but the rise of voices. So they passed laws. In 1351, the English Parliament passed the Statute of Laborers, fixing wages at pre-plague levels, forbidding workers to leave their villages. It was an attempt to stop the flow of change, to freeze time. But winter had taught the poor a lesson. If they could survive that, they could survive anything. So they resisted, quietly at first, then loudly. In 1381, the peasants' revolt shook the kingdom. They marched not just with pitchforks, but with ideas. Ideas born not of books, but of hunger, of being forgotten. And food remained at the heart of it all. It was no longer enough to eat. They wanted to own land, harvest, dignity. One rebel leader was said to have shouted, "We are not beasts to be fed and flogged." But history rarely favors the hungry for long. Revolt was crushed, its leaders hanged, their names erased, and still the idea remained. and so did the memory of famine, of stew without meat, of bread without flour, of winters so silent even the wolves stopped howling. This memory passed from lips to ears, through lullabies, through warning tales, through the eyes of old women stirring pots of nettles. Even as cities grew, even as kings changed thrones, that memory clung to the bones of Europe. It shaped architecture, narrow alleys, steep roofs, built not for style, but for warmth. It shaped language, phrases like buy bread alone or not worth a crust. It shaped law, grain tariffs, food riots, subsidies for salt, and it shaped the soul. To be born in those centuries was to inherit a contract with winter. You may survive, but you will never forget. That's why, centuries later, during wars and storms and other plagues, people would still hoard bread, still bless salt, still teach their children to eat the crusts, because they knew deep down that hunger is a ghost that never leaves. But not all memory lives in books. Some of it simmers quietly in kitchens that no longer have names. In the centuries that followed the Great Hunger and the Black Death, Europe tried to rebuild, tried to forget. But forgetting is a luxury. The poor do not forget, because memory was not a poem or a manuscript. It was a recipe, half remembered. It was a superstition, passed from mother to daughter. It was a warning, carved into the rhythm of daily life. A pot left to boil too long was not laziness. It was caution, because undercooked grain could sicken a child. A pinch of bitter root in the stew was not wasteful. It was wisdom, because bitterness slowed rot. Every dish carried a story, not of delight, but of endurance. Consider the peasant stews of Eastern Europe, thick with barley, laced with cabbage and onion, boiled until it no longer remembered its parts. Or the humble black bread of the Baltics, dense, sour, heavy as stone. It was designed not to please, but to last. There were no cookbooks for the common folk, only eyes that watched, hands that learned by touch. A grandmother might teach her grandchild. If the dough sticks too long to the bowl, the air is too wet. If the herbs smell like rain, don't use them. The devil has passed through. Foolish words to some, but to the ones who lived it, this was science, wrapped in story, data, wrapped in prayer. Because winter did not kill knowledge, it only buried it under frost and fear. And in these kitchens of clay and soot, that knowledge waited. Take salt, for example. Salt was not just seasoning, it was survival. Without it, meat spoiled. Without it, cheese soured too fast. Without it, a body grew weak. Entire wars were fought over salt. Empires taxed it. Smugglers carried it in shoes. Peasants sometimes dissolved a pinch into broth not to taste, but to remember that their blood still ran. And there were other rituals, a loaf marked with a cross before a slicing, a pot stirred clockwise, never against the sun, a first bite offered to the fire. These weren't just habits, they were contracts with time, with loss, with the past, because in a world where food betrayed them, these people made meaning from the crumbs. And what of the seasons? They were not calendar boxes or quaint symbols. They were verdicts. The spring might be your only chance to forage greens, nettles, sorrel, young shoots, not delicacies, but medicine, things to push the sickness of winter out of the body. The summer was not rest. It was frenzy, harvest before the storms returned. The autumn was calculation. Do we have enough to last until the thaw? The winter was judgment. It's why even today in languages from Gaelic to German, there are dozens of words for different types of cold. There is cold that stings, cold that settles in bones, cold that cracks wood, cold that steals breath, because they knew them all, intimately. And through it all, food was never just sustenance. It was memory management. It was grief therapy. It was survival theater. The poor did not write their histories in ink. They wrote them in broth, in husks, in soot, a burned crust. That was the moment the mother collapsed from exhaustion. A thin gruel? That was the day the eldest gave her portion to the baby. A thickened soup with too much salt? That was the day they buried someone. And yet, these foods endured, because to change them too much would be to forget. So when nobles began importing spices, the poor still reached for garlic. When sugar came in from the east, they still used fermented berries to sweeten bread, not because they didn't want the luxury, but because they knew it wouldn't last. Luxury is a wave, memory is a stone, and memory, when passed from mouth to mouth, can feed generations. Even today, when you eat an old peasant dish, when you taste a broth made from bones and nothing else, you are tasting resilience. You are tasting centuries of people who said, "I will not be erased." But slowly, almost shyly, life began to return. Not the kind that trumpets itself, not the kind sung in churches or scribed in noble parchments, but the quiet, warm-breathed kind, a child's laugh during harvest, the clatter of a ladle on a stone pot, the faint aroma of bread at dawn. In the wake of death and want, Europe's peasants began not only to eat, but to cook again. This was not cuisine as we think of it, no plating, no prestige. It was still a war of ingredients, a war against scarcity. But now the poor were not just surviving, they were rebuilding memory through taste. Markets re-emerged in village squares by abbeys, along dirt roads packed hard by foot traffic. At first, they were crude. Goats tied to posts, baskets of dried herbs, fish pickled in desperation. But over time, the rhythm returned. Market day became more than trade. It became theater. Women haggled not just over onions, but over pride. A farmer's apples might taste of sun or of failure. Bread loaves were judged not only for size, but for soul. A well-baked rye loaf was a status symbol in a hut with no floor. A handful of hazelnuts could be a child's treasure or a dowry's promise. And amid the bartering and gossip, something sacred began to form, the revival of craft. The baker wasn't just someone who owned an oven. He was someone who coaxed warmth from damp walls, who measured yeast not with scales, but with breath. The brewer wasn't just a man with a barrel. He was a steward of timing, of heat, of patience. Even the cheesemaker, often a woman, was now a keeper of secret passed through whispers. How long to let it cure, when to wrap it in ash? Why, some molds were blessings in disguise. These were not fancy things, but they were intentional, and that made them revolutionary, because for the first time in generations, food began to reflect not just what was left, but what was chosen. It was an act of quiet rebellion to say, "I will salt this fish my way," or "This barley soup will have time because my grandmother liked time." Choice, after so much imposed hunger, was a feast. Still, let us not romanticize too quickly. The poor were still poor. Grain still failed. Taxes still rose. But they had reclaimed something more stubborn than gold: agency. And agency gives birth to culture. Out of this fertile soil came dishes that would one day be cherished, not by dukes or kings, but by those who had always known how to make do. In the Pyrenees, stews thickened with stale bread and wild garlic. In Bohemia, dumplings made of flour and memory. In the north, herring cured so deeply in salt that it tasted like history. None of these were designed for pleasure alone. They were designed for continuity, to keep a child full, to stretch the harvest to the next moon, to comfort a widow who still lit 2 candles, though one plate sat empty. And so food, once an enemy or an uncertainty, became something else. Ritual. To bake meant to hope. To stir meant to believe there would be mouths to feed. To ferment meant to say, there will be a tomorrow. And those rituals made their way into the bones of society. Guilds formed, not for art, but for bread. Bakers' guilds, butchers' guilds, even spice merchants, though few and far between. They set standards, protected recipes, passed down knowledge with the seriousness once reserved for war. Because food was war, the only kind the poor could fight with their own hands. Even monasteries adapted, no longer only sites of prayer, they became sites of production, of cheese, of honeyed wine, of salted fish. The monks prayed with their mouths full, not in gluttony, but in gratitude. And from these slow, humble evolutions came something extraordinary. The idea that food could mean more than calories, that it could carry memory, bear witness, whisper joy, a leek pie made for a midwinter feast, a bannock baked for the first day of spring, a broth brewed not for illness, but for reunion. The ingredients were still meager, but the meaning was rich. And as these dishes passed through centuries, they became the roots of national identity. But let us not call them tradition yet, because to the people who made them, they were not performing history. They were surviving, and in that survival, they found a secret. Food, real food, made with worn hands and stubborn hope, is an act of rebellion against death. In time, what began as necessity became story. Food was no longer just about survival. It became a language, a dialect of dough, of bone, of fire. And like all language, it evolved, but only in the mouths of those who dared to remember. A wedding feast was not just a celebration. It was a performance of hope, a communal vow that even in hunger there would be sweetness. Sometimes that sweetness came from honey if the year had been kind. Other times, just from boiled fruit or browned butter hoarded for weeks. But it didn't matter, because what mattered was that it was shared. To eat together, especially after centuries of famine and war, was a radical act. And the menu didn't have to impress. It had to bless. A circle of bread with salt in the center to remind guests that joy without hardship is hollow. A roasted root vegetable split evenly among all to say, no one shall leave empty. Even funerals had recipes. They were called different names in different tongues. Soul cakes, morning broth, ashes bread, always simple, always dark, always laced with meaning. The food was never for the dead. It was for the living left behind, to put something warm inside the cold cavity that grief left. A woman might bake with trembling hands, not because she wanted to, but because to feed others was the only way she could keep herself from disappearing. These dishes became rituals, and rituals became culture. You see, a culture is not what hangs in a palace. It is what steams in the corners of huts, what is stirred when no one is watching. A culture is the decision to serve the heel of the loaf to the guest, because the crust is the best part. It is the passing of a pot across generations, its blackened sides carrying the fingerprints of the dead. And in this way, even poverty became sacred, not because it was beautiful, but because those who endured it chose to make beauty from it. They took ash and made ink. They took bones and made broth. They took scarcity and made meaning. And from that meaning came identity. This is how the Irish came to be known by their soda bread, how the French peasant guarded his cassoulet, how the German grandmother stirred spatzel with the same rhythm she once rocked her child. Each region, each hamlet, each family built its own map, not of land, but of flavor. And that map was more honest than any drawn by king or knight, because it told the truth of suffering and of resilience. Over time, some of these recipes reached nobility, not because the poor offered them, but because the rich took note. Monasteries recorded the techniques, markets grew more sophisticated, and slowly peasant food began to be called rustic, then traditional, then authentic. But in the mouths of the poor, it was never any of those things. It was daily. It was unremarkable. It was everything. When a mother taught her child how to pickle, she wasn't preserving cabbage. She was preserving time. When a grandfather showed a boy how to gut a fish and salt it before dusk, he was saying, "This is how we survived." And that we carried weight. It meant more than bloodlines. It meant memory shared by doing. You didn't have to speak the same language to know what it meant when someone offered you the last potato in the pot. That was universal, and it was sacred. So even today, when we call something comfort food, we're echoing centuries of people who found ways to comfort themselves when nothing else could. When you sip broth on a sick day, you are holding a bowl that once warmed a plague widow. When you bake bread to calm your nerves, you are kneading the same hope as a medieval mother who feared the first frost. When you cook something just like your grandmother did, you are not merely feeding your body, you are resurrecting her. Food is memory, and memory is defiance. And the poor, who had no castles, no portraits, no monuments, built cathedrals of meaning in their kitchens, unseen, uncelebrated, but unshakable. And yet, as centuries turned their pages and the rhythm of life quickened, something fragile began to dim, not all at once. No, culture never dies in a moment. It fades like smoke, curling upward while we're too busy looking down. The hearth was replaced by the stove, the community oven by a factory, the hand-turned butter churned by stainless steel silence. And with each improvement, a thread of memory snapped. The stew still boiled, but it no longer carried the story of the mother who stirred it. The bread still rose, but the hands that shaped it were now gloved, distant, mechanical. Food remained, but meaning retreated. As cities grew, people grew apart, not just from each other, but from what they ate. The flour came in bleached sacks, the vegetables in cans, the meat pre-cut, shrink-wrapped, price per pound. No more whispers of soil, no more dirt under fingernails, just quiet aisles and humming fluorescence. And so began a strange kind of hunger, one not born from famine, but from forgetting. People were fed, yes, full even, but not rooted, not connected, not nourished in the way their ancestors had been even through scarcity. The meals became quicker, the rituals evaporated. The soul of food, its quiet ceremony, was flattened into convenience. A microwave replaced the passing of a pot. A drive-through silenced the gossip of market women. Recipes were measured by clicks, not memory. Children no longer watched their elders cook. They watched screens. They didn't know where salt came from or why their grandmother used bay leaves only on Sundays. But the body remembers what the mind forgets. And across the globe, small echoes began to rise. A whisper here, a sigh there. A woman needs dough not because she must, but because it reminds her of a mother's hands. A man stirs soup and tastes his grandfather's voice. A family plants tomatoes on a balcony, not out of need, but out of longing. Longing for something real, for something touched, for something earned. And slowly, quietly, the ancient rituals return, not out of poverty, but out of choice. Bread baking on weekends, herbs growing in kitchen windows, communal dinners with mismatched plates and shared stories. The return was never perfect, nor complete, but it was honest. It said, I choose slowness. I choose care. I choose to know who grew this and how. And in that choosing, something sacred stirred again. Because when you cook from scratch, you're never alone. You carry a chorus of monks boiling barley in the shadows of stone, of peasant girls picking nettles with torn sleeves, of tired mothers who gave the best portion to the smallest child, of lovers who whispered recipes in the dark when saying, I love you, was too dangerous. You carry them, not in memory alone, but in motion, in flame, in salt. So now when you crack an egg or peel a carrot or simmer broth on a cold night, pause. You're standing in a cathedral older than any church, the kitchen, not the room, but the act. And that act, done with intention, is a prayer to those who fed without thanks, who starved without bitterness, who built 1,000 tomorrows from whatever scraps they had left. And as you eat, quietly, slowly, know this. You are not just enjoying comfort. You are continuing a rebellion. You are saying, even now in this world of rush and noise, I remember that food is not a product. It is a promise that someone once made to someone else. I will feed you, even if I go hungry. A promise that held civilization together when everything else fell apart. And today, even as we dine in warmth, with full bellies and endless options, let us not be arrogant. Let us be grateful. Because what we eat now was once someone's dream, someone's struggle, someone's sacrifice. And every bite we take in peace is their victory. And so, dear traveler, as we near the end of this quiet walk through cold stone corridors and smoky kitchens, let us pause once more, not in haste, but in reverence. We have walked beside those who ate in silence, who carried wood on frost-bitten shoulders, who stirred thin broth and called it sustenance, who passed down knowledge not in books, but in gestures. A pinch of this, a stir that goes clockwise, a pause until the steam says, now. They had no titles, no tapestries hung with their names, no feasts written into the chronicles of kings. But they kept the world turning. They fed armies and infants, widows and wanderers. They offered what they had, sometimes too little, sometimes just enough, and always with more heart than flour. They are not the ones who shaped empires, but they are the ones who kept empires from collapsing, not with swords, with stew. And now in this modern world of gleaming countertops and instant everything, we carry their inheritance whether we know it or not. Every time we cook from scratch, every time we feed someone we love, every time we sit at a table without a screen, we are not just reclaiming presence. We are reviving an unbroken chain of survival that stretches backward 1,000 years. So when the world feels cold, when things seem rushed and shallow, remember, your hands know more than you think. They remember what it means to stir with patience, to slice with intention, to salt just enough, because salt was once gold. Let cooking become your resistance. Let eating become your remembrance. Let gratitude season every bite. And when you finish a meal, don't just throw away the bones. Don't just wipe the plate clean. Sit, close your eyes, and think of her, that nameless woman who once knelt by a hearth centuries ago, her children coughing beside her, and still she found a way to make something warm. Think of him, that old man in the village edge, alone, but for the soup pot he stirred for the orphans next door. Think of all of them, the forgotten, the ordinary, the broken, the beautiful. Their breath lives in yours. Their hunger shaped your plenty. Their resilience brought you rest. So the next time you eat, not just fancy, not just full, but truly eat with all 5 senses awake and one heart wide open, know this: you are not only nourishing yourself, you are honoring a covenant that says, I will not forget. I will not forget the cold. I will not forget the smoke. I will not forget the silence in which they kept feeding. And most of all, I will not forget to be thankful, because to be fed in peace is a blessing carved from the bones of generations who never had that luxury. They ate in darkness so we might dine in light. Let us earn it, one meal at a time, one memory at a time, one humble thanks at a time.